So today, as Danielle said, I'm going to be talking to you a bit about what you should know about clinical trials. So what is a clinical trial? It's a research study that people volunteer to be a part of in order to test a new drug or a new device. So physicians need them to learn about whether or not these new treatments work and if these treatments are safe for their patients. Clinical trials are the only way that we can bring new therapies to patients with cancer. So every new treatment, as it goes through clinical trials, before it can be approved and it can be used, it has to go through this process, and the Food and Drug Administration needs to approve this drug based on the information that we gain from clinical trials. So what do we learn from clinical trials? There are really two main questions that physicians try to focus on clinical trials, and that's first and foremost, is this treatment safe? Is the treatment safe for the patients? So all treatments come with risk. If you look at the bottle of Tylenol, you'll see that there are hundreds and hundreds of side effects listed as part of just Tylenol. So clinical trials, although these new treatments come with risk, they help determine if the benefits of that drug or that treatment outweigh the risk of the treatment. So the other question that physicians ask as part of a clinical trial is whether or not the drug works. Is it efficacious? Does the treatment work well? Is it better than the currently approved treatments? Does it yield better response, or does it have less side effects than the currently approved treatments that are out there and available? And also, does it work better for certain people? So within clinical trials, they may do certain testing that is related to your genetics, and they may try to understand based on your genes, does a therapy work for some people better than it does others? So this slide talks about how clinical trials are conducted. I'll start by saying it's a very, very long road. Before the studies can even make their way to be available to people, it has to go through lab studies. So the scientists have to determine whether or not a certain agent or treatment is safe enough to bring to people to begin with. So for about 6 years, they're doing lab studies. Now, these could be studies that they do on animals. They could be studies that they do in cells. So that's a petri dish in a lab. And they have to determine, based on those lab studies, is it safe enough to bring to humans, to their patients? So that process can take about 6 years. So from the time we have a concept before it even gets to you, 6 years. After that, there's a phase, the trials happen in phases. So for phase 1, that's really a very small group of people that if they choose to volunteer to participate, the physicians will look at how this drug is working. Is it safe? That's the primary question for a phase 1 clinical trial. Now, after that, if they determine that drug is safe on that small group of people, they'll move it to a much larger study, and that's called a phase 1/2 or a phase 2 trial. In a phase 2 trial, they're testing the drug on many, many more people, and they're gathering information on how safe that drug is or how safe the treatment is. Within that phase, although sometimes a phase 2 study is not supposed to test for efficacy in cancer clinical trials, I can tell you that they start looking at whether or not that drug is working, if it's providing patients with a good response very early on, usually as early as the phase 1 trials. Now, if it's safe and if they're finding evidence that the drug works, then they move it to a phase 3, and that's thousands and thousands of patients nationally or internationally that will volunteer to participate in that kind of a trial. From there, if they find enough evidence that that drug is safe and that it works, and that process can take about 8 years on average, they'll move for the Food and Drug Administration approval. So remember, we can't approve a drug until we show evidence that it works and that it's safe. Now, while that approval is happening, the trial may go into another expanded phase, which is a phase 4 study. And that's really, we call it pharmacovigilance. It's to make sure that after the drug is available to patients, that we're still collecting data, that we're being diligent and looking at the long-term effects of that drug. And so that process for FDA approval can take up to 2 years. So through this process, if I were a patient, I would want to know, how are you going to keep me safe? It's a test drug. It's being tested on me. So how are you keeping me safe? Well, there's a very long process to get a trial to patients. First, a protocol has to be developed by the physician that has the concept, the idea for this new treatment. They have to develop this protocol, and then that protocol goes through various committees made up of other physicians that are qualified to understand what's going on with this trial, what the mechanisms of the drug are and how it works. And so the first step is really a peer review committee. Peer review means that a group of physicians are going to sit there and they're going to scrutinize this study, the clinical trial. They're going to make sure that they think it's safe, that they think from a scientific standpoint that this study makes sense. So NYU Langone Medical Center, Perlmutter Cancer Center is an NCI designated cancer center. That means we're designated by the National Cancer Institute. And part of that designation means that we're mandated to have what's called a protocol review and monitoring system. So we have our own committee within NYU. And so again, they're reviewing to make sure that this study makes sense. And for example, a question that might come up at a peer review committee is from a statistician. So if the physician wants to test the drug on 100 people, the statistician may ask, why 100? Why not 25? Why should we expose more people to this if we don't have to? So that could just be one example of a question that might come up. And then after the peer review committee approves the study, if they approve the study, they're also going to continue reviewing that study from year to year to see how it's progressing and see how patients are doing on the trial. Another committee that the trial needs to be approved by is called a Data and Safety Monitoring Committee. So every clinical trial within the protocol, the physician has to write up what's called a Data and Safety Monitoring Plan. So this plan has to show how they're going to look at all the side effects that all of the patients are reporting and how they're going to determine that those side effects are not too egregious or too unsafe to continue. So it's constantly being reviewed. You're a patient, you decide you want to volunteer for a clinical trial, you come in to see your physician and you report to your physician how you're feeling, what your side effects are. In a clinical trial, all of those side effects get recorded. And the physician has to go through every single one of your symptoms and they have to assess the severity of that symptom. So how severe is it? They have to assess whether or not they think it's related to the investigational or the test drug. They have to assess whether or not it's expected based on what they know about that drug. So it's a very, very detailed process, and every single symptom you report ends up getting in front of a large committee of people that review it and make sure collectively all of our patients continue to be safe. So this plan in the study protocol, it's not only a plan to make sure that we're reviewing everything, but that plan is scrutinized. It has to be approved by many, many different entities. It has to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration before that protocol is even approved to move forward. It has to be approved by the peer review committee. In addition, there's an institutional review board. Now, this is another committee that every single clinical trial needs to be approved by. This committee focuses more on ethics. So is this study safe for participants, for the people who volunteer to be a part of it? Is it ethical in its design and how it's going to be conducted? IRBs focus on three main areas. That's beneficence. So they're going to look at the study protocol and they're going to ask the question, are they more than the benefits? They want to make sure that the benefit to the patient is more than the risk. That's called the risk to benefit ratio. Respect for persons. That means that an IRB has to make sure that every single physician for a clinical trial is presenting the patient with all of the information up front so they can make an informed decision. So you're going to get an informed consent form. It could be 20 pages long. It's full of information about the clinical trial and what's going to happen if you decide to participate in the trial. It tells you about all of the risks of that clinical trial. It tells you how we think you might benefit. And it also tells you who to contact if anything is going to happen. That's a very important document, and the IRB scrutinizes that document very carefully. And justice. This is very important. A lot of clinical trials now have very, very stringent eligibility criteria. So the IRB has to make sure that everyone's being treated fairly. That means that nobody can be excluded for any reason. So minorities cannot be excluded from participating in clinical trials. They need to be available to everyone equally. So in addition to this initial review, the IRB will not give a stamp of approval if they think the study is not ethical. But after that, as the study is progressing, just like the Data and Safety Monitoring Committee and just like the peer review committee, this protocol gets reviewed often, even while patients are being seen on the protocol. So every year we have to submit a progress report, and we have to let them know how everybody's doing on the trial. If a patient comes in and reports that they had an event, that there was a symptom they had, and the doctor said that that was a serious symptom, that has to go to the institutional review board right away within 24 hours so they can review it and make sure that everything's okay. And if the protocol is changed, if the physician decides that they want to amend the protocol or edit the protocol, they cannot make that change to that study until the institutional review board approves it. And so this is a lot of information about a lot of different committees, but the point is that a protocol, it takes a very long time to get to patients because there are a lot of people trying to make sure that sending this protocol out to our patients is safe and that it makes sense. That brings us to why does it take so long? Well, there are lots and lots of barriers to completing a clinical trial. You've seen the process, how long it takes to even get to you as patients. It takes 6 years after lab studies to get to you. And then after that, we go through multiple review processes to make sure that you're safe as patients. And then once we get the trial available to you, unfortunately, less than 5% of adults with cancer participate. Now, the last statistic I read showed that 60% of children actually participate in cancer clinical trials. And that's a huge difference. And that's one of the reasons that there have been such great advances in pediatric oncology in the last 30 years. So we really want to make sure that patients know about clinical trials, they understand what clinical trials are. Another statistic I read last night was that 36% of patients said that had they understood clinical trials or known about clinical trials more, they would have been willing to participate. That being said, there are other barriers. Lots of patients may be uncomfortable with volunteering on a clinical trial. There's something called a guinea pig complex. They don't want to have anything tested on them, which makes sense. So I would encourage you that when you're talking to your doctor, ask lots of questions. Take all the time you need to understand what the clinical trial is about. And then worry about being harmed by an unproven treatment. Again, keep in mind that there are lots and lots of tests that go on before the trial gets to you to show that it's safe for you as the patient. Another barrier is stringent eligibility criteria. So from a scientific standpoint, we really want to make sure that we're analyzing the data correctly. And part of that is that we are only enrolling certain types of patients. Those eligibility criteria now on cancer clinical trials, I can tell you, might be 4 or 5 pages long. So sometimes it's very, very hard for us to get patients to enroll because of these criteria. And that really extends the life cycle of a clinical trial. And then last but not least is costs. They're very, very expensive to run. And so we have to make sure we have the funding to keep these trials going. So there's some terminology you're going to want to know when you're thinking about volunteering for a clinical trial. A lot of these terms you might see in your informed consent form. The first is randomization. So many clinical trials are randomized clinical trials. That means that you could be assigned to a treatment. There might be more than 2 treatments, or what we call 2 arms on a study. So for example, a 2-arm trial, you might get randomized to either the treatment or the control group. A control group could be a group that just gives you the regular standard of care. So what you would get anyway if you weren't participating in a clinical trial. And the other arm could be the treatment that they're testing. And that's to just compare the two to make sure that one works better than the other, to analyze that. So A controlled group could possibly be a placebo. And a placebo is just an inactive drug. In cancer clinical trials, you may ask, well, how could you give me placebo? You can't give me placebo for this type of disease. They really don't. What happens is they give you the standard of care plus a placebo, or they might give you the treatment, and then they'll compare the treatment arm with the placebo arm to see if there are any differences. And then there's blind and double blind. So in a blinded study, the patient won't know what treatment they're getting. They won't know if they're getting the standard of care plus placebo or the standard of care plus the investigational or test drug. In a double blind study, the patient won't know, but the doctor also won't know. Now that could be scary to some patients. The doctor won't know what you're getting, but they always have the ability to unblind the study. So when you see double blind, you should ask the physician, if something happens or if you're worried about something, how will I find out what treatment I'm on? At any time, they can call and they can find out. So cancer clinical trials at our center. At the Perlmutter Cancer Center, we have over 100 cancer clinical trials open and available to patients at any given time, and that number is increasing. Right now, we have about 15 breast cancer studies that are open, with about 5 more in the pipeline to open very soon. And again, those numbers are going to be continuously increasing. We have trials that we recruit for at the Cancer Center on 34th Street, but we also open our trials and make them available to patients at Bellevue, to patients that are seen in some of our facilities in Long Island, and there are plans to open these trials in other boroughs in the very near future. If you want to know about clinical trials, I would encourage you to go to clinicaltrials.gov. When you go to that website and you search by whatever cancer you want to look into, you'll see a list of clinical trials, but not just the names of the trials. You're going to see all the information about that trial. You're going to get contact information of where those trials are being offered and how you can get in touch with the doctor that's conducting the trial at their center. There's also a search functionality for clinical trials. So if you Google NYU LMC clinical trials, there'll be a website where you could look at all the trials that are available here at NYU. And last but not least, I would strongly encourage you to always ask your physician about clinical trials. You're going to want to know what all of your options are. Ask them about clinical trials. Talk to them about clinical trials. They're there to give you information and to spend the time with you to talk to you about these things and to answer all of your questions. So with that, I thank you for your time. As you can see, it's a very long road to get therapies to you as our patients. And hopefully later I'll be able to answer any questions you might have.